Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Inside Number 9 Season 9. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The first story begins with a train slowly pulling into the station. Gentleman Jerry helped his wife Edith onto the carriage and they found an empty seat. Soon after, another passenger, Raymond, also got on board. Jerry and Edith shared a knowing look as they munched on apples. Oddly, the two men, Raymond and Finn, seemed anxious, their eyes darting around the carriage. As the train moved forward, an announcement crackled over the speakers. The next station was experiencing issues, and the train would not be stopping. Finn cursed loudly, stood up, and studied the subway map. The greasy old man Harold removed his headphones and asked Elena with a grin about the announcement. A moment ago, Jerry and Edith were excitedly discussing a play, but suddenly they were bickering. Annoyed, Jerry told Edith to keep quiet. Just then, a beggar entered the carriage looking frail and helpless, asking for help. Edith wanted to give him some money, but Jerry stopped her. The beggar moved on, receiving only £2 from Elena, a small gesture that Edith tried to comfort him with. As the beggar approached Jerry and Edith's seat again, Edith wanted to help, but Jerry's insistence held her back. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt, and the beggar, unprepared, was thrown to the floor. At that moment, the lights went out, plunging everyone into darkness and fear. To add more fear, Harold then brought up a chilling story he'd read about a train in another country that broke down, trapping passengers for 2 weeks, during which none survived due to desperate infighting. This tale only fueled their panic. Elena screamed, and just then the lights flickered back on. Raymond asked Elena what had happened. She explained that in the dark, someone had groped her and that her wallet was missing from her backpack. Jerry suggested there must be a pervert and a thief in the carriage. Raymond tried to calm Elena and demanded the beggar empty his pockets. The beggar was bewildered and insisted he was not a thief, especially since Elena had just given him money. Jerry continued to stir the pot, leading to a heated argument. Harold stood up, offering his bag for inspection first, to ease tensions. Raymond checked it, finding nothing but was repulsed by its contents, declining to search further. Reluctantly, Jerry volunteered to be searched to clear his name. Feeling guilty amidst the chaos, Elena confided in Finn that her wallet had no money, but held a cherished photo of her late father. Raymond searched Jerry and Edith's pockets, then turned to the beggar, demanding compliance. Humiliated, the beggar allowed the search, revealing nothing. Determined to end the farce, the beggar decided to report the incident to the conductor. Without finding the thief, the commotion seemed unending. Finn suddenly became curious about Raymond's job. He thought he was always watching everyone, jotting things down in his newspaper. Raymond explained that he was a teacher and was just doing a crossword puzzle. However, Finn remained convinced that Raymond was observing them like a security camera. Suddenly, Harold, who had been silent for a while, stood up and loudly announced that he had once seen aliens at a bus stop. He claimed they cut open his backside and implanted a robot inside. Everyone thought he was joking except for Raymond, who had checked the bag and agreed that Harold was telling the truth. The atmosphere turned icy as Raymond began to criticize Finn. Finn held onto his backpack tightly, refusing to let it be searched. Elena, not wanting her missing wallet to cause a huge argument, suggested they leave it to the police. Raymond's arrogance annoyed Cleo, and the two started arguing. Raymond, who had been teaching for many years, lamented that respect for authority was declining, but Cleo found his anger inexplicable. Suddenly, Harold, still wearing his headphones, started singing a church hymn. As he sang, Raymond approached Finn again, demanding to search his bag, suspecting him because he was closest to Elena when the incident happened. Edith stood up and suggested they vote. If everyone agreed, Finn would have to show them his bag. Before anyone could react, Raymond snatched Finn's bag and tried to search it. Finn fought back, and Raymond grabbed him by the throat. As Raymond tightened his grip, everyone watched in shock, frozen in place. Fortunately, Cleo shouted, and the beggar returned, announcing that the conductor was aware of the incident and would fix it soon. Raymond, calming down, glared at Cleo before returning to his seat. Elena felt sorry for the beggar and sat next to him, offering comfort using words only but not her muscles. Jerry asked his wife if she wanted to see a play that weekend. Edith, still shaken, refused without hesitation, feeling that Jerry was too indifferent to the events on the train, not like the man she first met. But Jerry didn't want to hear it. His patience with Edith seemingly evaporated. The tense atmosphere was suffocating. Finn tried to leave the carriage, but Raymond stopped him, and the others began to dislike his behavior. Unexpectedly, Raymond turned his verbal attack on the beggar. Amid Raymond's insulting words, the beggar stood beside Finn, supporting his right to protect his bag. Cleo, disapproving of Raymond, joined them. Seeing everyone taking sides, Edith, against Jerry's wishes, also sided with Finn. Meanwhile, the group agreeing to check the bag, including Elena, another woman, and Harold, outnumbered Jerry's side. Reluctantly, Finn tossed the bag to Raymond. As Harold stood up and dramatically recited a eulogy, Raymond pulled several gas masks from the bag. Soon, the train entered a new station. Edith, Cleo, and the beggar were already waiting at the entrance. Finn instructed everyone to put on their masks. Jerry refused and patiently advised Edith to take a deep breath. As gas filled the carriage, the three pounded on the glass, panicking. Onlookers watched as the three collapsed from the gas. With the situation resolved, Finn returned Elena's wallet and explained that this was an irregular purge to eliminate troublemakers and rule breakers. If they needed help in the future, they could contact him. A shocked Elena asked what to do with those who had collapsed, but Finn dismissively replied that they were waiting outside the carriage. As the train stopped, he was the first to leave, followed by everyone else. Jerry helped his wife as before and asked if she wanted to see a play that weekend. This time, Edith didn't refuse. Elena watched as the three were carried out in bags, the station's cameras seemingly monitoring her from all directions. The second story begins with a car driving through the stormy night and stopping at the front door. A distressed man, Drew, drenched from head to toe, sat in a chair while Blake, a therapist, boiled water for him. Blake asked if he should call Drew's family, but Drew declined the offer. Blake was curious, wondering why no one had stopped to help Drew, who had stood by the river for so long and wanted to leap to his death from the bridge. Drew explained that there were around 20 or 30 people on the bridge at the time. They probably thought he was just admiring the scenery. Drew then asked Blake why he had stopped to help. Blake explained that as a therapist, he sensed Drew needed help and decided to pull over. Noticing Drew's discomfort, he suggested there was no need to discuss anything he didn't want to and left Drew to relax alone. Drew wandered around the room and, gazing out at the rain, asked Blake if it was true that farmers in the countryside often went mad and committed suicide. Blake confirmed this, but noted that the countryside also offered peace and quiet, which is why he had moved his practice there. Drew casually took off his coat and laid it aside. Blake asked if he had shared his situation with anyone else. Drew explained that he had spoken to his doctor, but only before 8 p.m., as it required waiting for 45 minutes. Drew was curious about Blake's therapy sessions. What did he say if someone didn't want to talk? Blake explained that it depended entirely on the patient. He offered a place to process emotions and also conducted stress relief courses. Afterward, Drew chose laughter yoga as a treatment method. Guided by Blake's laughter, Drew laughed until his laughter turned into tears. Seeing this, Blake gently comforted him, encouraging him to cry and release the stress. But then, Blake noticed a gun behind Drew's back. He took a few steps back, made an excuse to leave Drew, and handed him a tissue. Blake encouraged Drew to express what he was holding inside. Drew admitted he felt he might have killed someone. Blake immediately thought of the gun behind Drew and wanted to say something, but Drew cut him off, emotionally demanding that Blake stop analyzing him. After yelling, Drew composed himself, and to ease the tension, he asked to use Blake's bathroom. While he was gone, Blake took some medicine from a cabinet, and in the bathroom, Drew, after noticing a painting on the wall, took out a few pills from his pocket. Before Drew returned, Blake sprinkled some powder into Drew's teacup. Learning that the painting in the bathroom was by Blake's son, Drew remarked he used to love painting too. Blake suggested that art opened the mind, then brought over the tea, proposing they sit on the sofa and chat, with Drew expressing his thoughts through drawing. While Blake fetched the art supplies, Drew slipped all his pills into Blake's teacup. Blake returned with the drawing materials, and a strange atmosphere enveloped them. Drew raised his cup in a toast, and after seeing him drink, Blake drank as well. However, Drew had used too many pills. After only a few words, Blake's vision blurred, and he soon slumped forward. When Blake awoke, he found himself bound to a cabinet. Drew asked why Blake had drugged him. Blake explained that he feared Drew, given the gun and his statement about possibly killing someone. But he didn't understand why Drew drugged him. Drew revealed that everything had been part of his plan. The bridge and his appearance there were all premeditated to lure Blake in. Blake still naively assumed Drew was a robber, but Drew, growing emotional, accused him of being a poor therapist. Blake tried to threaten Drew by saying his son would return soon, but Drew was unfazed. All Drew wanted was for Blake to share his experience and truly empathize with him. Drew began looking around the room and soon noticed a picture frame filled with images of several people. Blake explained that these were psychiatric patients and part of a psychological test used to reveal a patient's deepest thoughts. Drew chose a few images that represented depression and sadism, although he clearly didn't believe he had either condition. He then brought up a well-known thought experiment, the trolley problem. A speeding train hurtles down a track where 5 people are tied up, but he stands at a lever that can divert the train to another track where 1 person is tied up. Drew asked Blake whether it was better to sacrifice 1 person to save 5 or let the train run over the 5. Blake sighed and explained that it depends on what outcome the person at the lever desires. The act of pulling the lever is akin to murder, but it can save more people. The difference lies between actively killing and passively allowing people to die. Drew countered, asking about a third option. If he threw himself onto the track to save the 6 people, what should he choose? Blake replied that if the 5 people on the track were renowned wise individuals, he might sacrifice himself, but if the 6 were strangers to him, he would likely do nothing. Despite all this conversation, Blake still didn't understand why Drew had kidnapped him. Drew sat down and asked if he knew a girl named Ellie. At first, Blake feigned ignorance until Drew played a recording. In the recording, Blake encouraged Ellie to pull down her stinky pants and show him the scars on her thighs, his words suggesting dirty harassment. But Blake insisted he and Ellie were in a hormone relationship. Drew then asked why Blake had applied for a restraining order against Ellie. Blake explained that Ellie suffered from severe delusions and had become obsessed with him. She was estranged from her father and viewed Blake as a surrogate. Realizing this, Blake guessed that Drew was Ellie's father, and Drew did not deny it. Drew, saddened, revealed that Ellie had died. Their relationship had been strained, and even after she fell ill, he had pushed her away, only giving her money to seek psychiatric help. He never expected to be sending her to her death. Blake asked if Drew's earlier comment about having killed someone referred to Ellie, but Drew did not answer. Instead, he demanded Blake confess his crimes, that he had used drugs to control Ellie and abandoned her when she became a burden, even violating the restraining order to secretly meet her at a hotel and kill her. Blake denied ever going to the hotel. Drew pointed out that the coroner found Ellie had taken an overdose at 3 a.m., and surveillance footage showed someone resembling Blake leaving the hotel around 4 a.m. Drew argued that if that person had saved Ellie, the tragedy might have been avoided. But they didn't, illustrating Blake's distinction between passive death and active murder. Facing this evidence, Blake still refused to admit anything. Drew, gun in hand, demanded he write a confession. Blake agreed immediately, hoping to persuade Drew to untie him. As Drew loosened the binds, Blake casually grabbed a sharp tool and stabbed Drew's thigh, knocking him down before escaping. As he prepared to leave, something made him pause. Inside, Drew pulled the tool from his leg, dressed the wound, and was about to pursue Blake when the room plunged into darkness. Following the moonlight, he reached the door and found Blake there. Blake said the only advantage of living in the countryside was that it was easy to become a target for thieves, allowing him to stage a robbery and kill Drew in self-defense. As he spoke, Blake began scattering items around to create the illusion of a break-in. He admitted he moved to the countryside to escape Ellie, whose obsession had made him uneasy. Thus, he believed Ellie got what she deserved. He then threatened Drew, demanding he kneel and beg for mercy. Blake regretted his decision to bring Drew inside. As he raised a hook, he recalled Drew mentioning the many witnesses on the bridge, thinking it easier to let him drown and be rid of a problem. Before dying, Drew pleaded with Blake to admit what he did to Ellie, but Blake refused. Calm now, Drew was dragged to the car. He asked Blake to fetch his coat and check the note in the pocket. After ensuring Drew wouldn't escape, Blake returned to the house and found a slip of paper with a phone number in the pocket. Seeing Drew still outside, Blake dialed the number and was shocked to hear his son's voice, crying like a giant baby and begging for help. Blake frantically asked his son where he was, learning that Drew had locked him in a box and buried him somewhere. Blake then noticed Drew pouring gasoline over himself outside. Reassuring his son, Blake rushed out, begging Drew to reveal his son's location. But Drew, despondent, declared that Blake had made his choice. His death wouldn't be Drew's fault, but Blake's negligence. With that, Drew set himself ablaze, the flames engulfing him as the son's cries faded into the night. The story ends there. What seems like a tale of a father's revenge is, in reality, a narrative with no true hero. Blake, who chose to actively kill Ellie in the trolley problem, also became responsible for his son's death due to his selfishness. Drew offered him a third option he refused to take. In life, Drew was harsh and neglectful, driving his daughter to depend on Blake, embodying the choice of passive killing in the trolley problem. Seeking vengeance, he kidnapped Blake's son, choosing active murder. Aware of his hatred for this behavior, Drew ultimately chose to end his life in flames for redemption. The third story begins with a husband, Damon, taking out moving trash to the bins outside when later that night, foxes knocked them over. The following morning, his wife, Val, discovered the mess and reluctantly cleaned it up before heading to work. While tidying up, she ran into their neighbor, Larry, who was out walking his dog. Frustrated, Val threatened to put poison in the trash next time to keep the foxes away. Larry suggested she put a brick on the lid to prevent it from being knocked over. Val thought that was a good idea and quickly finished cleaning up before driving to work. Shortly afterward, their neighbors, Kenny and Sheila, from across the street arrived with a gift. They brought a cake to welcome Damon and Val to the neighborhood. Damon enjoyed chatting with them and agreed to have dinner together sometime. A car carefully navigated the street's potholes as the peaceful day progressed. That evening, Val returned from work, and she and Damon had a heated argument over a trivial matter, but they soon made up and spent the next day decorating their yard for Halloween. Their enthusiasm caught Sheila's attention, and she mentioned that the community didn't want to attract mischievous kids on Halloween, but it was clear Damon and Val were excited about the holiday and didn't heed Sheila's advice. Watching their animated devil decorations, Sheila bit back her frustration and wished them a good time. After the party, Damon returned home, still in his costume, and knocked on the door. He had forgotten his keys, much to Val's annoyance, but she let him in anyway. That night, they argued again, loud enough for the recycling crew outside to hear. The shouting stopped abruptly with a loud thud. The next morning, Larry rang their doorbell while walking his angry dog, concerned after hearing their argument. Kenny, returning from his morning jog, joined him, whispering about the strange noises they heard last night. After waiting a while with no response, Larry had to leave. Later that night, Damon was seen furtively dragging a suitcase to his car, returning home afterward. No one knew what was inside, but Kenny noticed a reddish stain like blood on the driveway during his morning jog. Days later, Sheila came by to retrieve a cheese dish she had previously lent them. Damon, clearly hungover, rudely told her Val wasn't home and refused to let her in to look for the dish. That evening, Damon drove away, and the three neighbors emerged, suspicious that Damon had done something to his wife. The bloodstains on the driveway and strange noises from the house hinted at something sinister. As they prepared to enter, they found that their old key couldn't open the door. Sheila noticed an open window on the second floor and instructed her husband to fetch a ladder from the shed. While he was gone, Sheila idly chatted with Larry, suggesting they could film the evidence and post it online as the Mulberry Street murders if they found proof of Damon's crimes. She then found a key to the back door. Larry guessed that Damon had only changed the front door key and not the back. Sheila entered through the back door, but as soon as she did, Larry's angry dog started barking loudly. Larry had to calm the dog down, but Damon unexpectedly returned home. Unaware of Sheila's presence, Damon entered casually, prompting Sheila to call out to Larry softly, asking him to bring over the trash bin so she could use it to climb out. As Larry moved the bin, Damon noticed him, forcing Larry to engage in casual conversation to cover up the situation. Kenny arrived with the ladder, adding to the awkwardness. He pretended to be fixing the drain pipe and asked Damon if he needed the ladder, leaving Damon puzzled. Damon explained he forgot his wallet at the gas station and was heading back out. Without another word, he left. Once he was gone, Sheila slipped out through the back door. Early in the morning, Damon stood at the door, gloomily smoking a cigarette. He called his wife, apologizing for their argument the previous night and asking if she could come home the next day. He told her that he had tidied up the house and was eager to see her again. After cleaning his car, he left for work. When he returned home, he angrily confronted his neighbor Kenny, accusing him of meddling in his life. Community police had visited Damon's workplace to ask about his wife, and although Kenny insisted he wasn't responsible, Damon knew it was Kenny who reported it to the community. Their argument drew Sheila's attention, and when she accused him, Damon wasted no time bringing up her breaking into his house through the back door. Even Larry, who was out walking his angry dog, was caught up in Damon's wrath, with Damon threatening that Larry would regret it if he accused him again. The night passed quietly. The next morning, Larry discovered his dog was missing and spent the entire day searching for it. That evening, Val returned home with her suitcase. As she took out the trash, she ran into Larry, who was still looking for his dog. Val explained that while she was away on business for a week, she and her husband had argued after he drunkenly spilled red wine on the mattress, pushed it down the stairs, and sawed it into pieces. This made Larry realize they had misunderstood Damon. Val could only offer Larry reassurance and hope that he found his dog soon. Seeing Val struggling to open the trash can lid with her hands full, Larry kindly offered to help, only to find his dog inside the trash bin. Val was confused by the situation, but Larry recalled Val's earlier comment about putting poison in the bin and stubbornly believed she had poisoned the dog. Unable to reason with Larry, Val went inside to call Damon, unaware that Larry picked up the brick from the trash can lid and followed her inside. Moments later, screams echoed from the house. Larry closed the door, carefully cradled his stiffened dog, and returned home. The next day, Damon was arrested by the police, although he insisted he had nothing to do with the incident. Sheila informed the visiting officers that the neighbors frequently heard the couple arguing and that she hadn't seen Val in over a week. Sheila and Kenny's relentless chatter contrasted sharply with Larry's calm demeanor. Larry then mentioned seeing Damon moving a heavy suitcase out of the house late at night. The police soon discovered Damon's doorbell camera. Reviewing the footage from 2 nights before, they saw Sheila hitting the runaway dog with her car and, disgusted, tossing its body into Damon's trash bin. It turned out Sheila was behind everything, leaving Val to shoulder the blame for something she didn't do. Damon and Val's argument had only been loud, yet the neighbors assumed he had killed his wife, presenting their assumptions as evidence to the police. Clearly, seeing isn't always believing, and hearing isn't always the truth. The 4th story begins with a man, Jason, taking his wife and daughters to an escape room adventure called Killer's Nest. The owner asked if they had played escape rooms before, and Jason's wife mentioned that Jason was the only one in the family who loved the game. Since they were familiar with the rules, the owner briefly explained the time limit and emphasized the importance of teamwork to solve the puzzles. Using a small flashlight to illuminate his face, he tried to create a spooky atmosphere. After telling the backstory, he chained Jason's stinky feet together, handed them a notebook, and reminded them they could request hints via the intercom, but only 3 times. Once the owner left, the escape room adventure officially began. Jason directed his wife and daughters to search for clues, but his older daughter seemed reluctant to participate and wasn't getting along with her younger sister or the environment. Then, his wife noticed something behind a red curtain. Pulling it aside, she found a bloody mannequin and discovered a locked cabinet nearby. Each compartment bore a name, which she guessed belonged to the victims. Soon, the younger daughter found a newspaper with victim information, and the older daughter found a girl's photo. From the photo, Jason deduced the first numeric clue. He then looked at a mirror and commented that he felt like someone was watching them, while he and his daughter were engrossed in solving the puzzles. The older daughter approached her mother and asked if she was ever jealous of Jason's ex-girlfriend. Her mother calmly replied that she and Jason had no secrets, but didn't want to discuss it in front of him. The daughter said she would continue to pretend the family was harmonious. She then found another victim clue on the wall. Hearing this, Jason tried to search for the green high heels mentioned in the clue, but his chains prevented him from moving. His wife gently reassured him and found the green heels in a box. Jason softly asked her not to exclude him from conversations with their daughter. Sitting on the bed, Jason recorded the clues they had found. His wife suddenly sat beside him, whispering that she never imagined being with anyone else. Jason didn't understand the strange comment. She caressed his cheek and said that despite the difficulties over the years, she still loved him deeply, then kissed him without using her tongue. Jason thought she was planning to leave him. Meanwhile, the lack of clues frustrated the older daughter, and she picked up the intercom for their first hint. The owner didn't directly give them the numbers, but instead guided her to discover new clues. Meanwhile, the mother and younger daughter found a map on the wall. Based on the witness descriptions, the younger daughter marked the victim's movements on the map with string, revealing the final number. The older daughter unlocked the cabinet, revealing a passageway. The mother climbed in first, followed by the younger daughter. Unable to move, Jason called out, hoping his daughter wouldn't leave him alone. After hesitating, the older daughter decided to stay. He asked her if she had any secrets with her mother and reassured her that she could talk to him if she needed someone to confide in. She told him she had been speaking, but he never responded. Jason was puzzled. Annoyed, she cut him off, saying she didn't want to hear his advice. At that moment, Jason was just a concerned father worried about his daughter's well-being. He hoped she wouldn't let anger affect her relationship with anyone or anything and encouraged her to find other ways to vent her emotions. Jason didn't want his daughter to leave, who had been by his side for 18 years, but he also wanted her to be independent and face the future confidently. Jason's daughter was moved by his words and began to recall a Christmas when she was 7 or 8 and the family went skiing. Frightened, she had clung tightly to the railing, but with her father's encouragement, she let go and fell, accidentally knocking him over too. The terrifying ice skates appeared before her eyes. Her story seemed to mend the bond between them, and as they embraced, they heard Jason's wife's voice over the intercom. She said they had found a key, but it would take 3 people to retrieve it. With a reluctant goodbye, the daughter crawled into the tunnel. After she left, Jason felt he shouldn't just sit and wait, so he began searching for more clues. He found a locked box and a few photographs, but couldn't reach inside the barrel due to its depth. He sorted colored paper clips based on the remaining letters in the photos, eventually figuring out the combination to open the box. Inside, he found a magnet, which he used to retrieve a UV flashlight from the barrel. He turned off the lights and shone the UV flashlight around, discovering numerous bloody handprints on the walls. When he removed the hanging picture, blood-red words on the wall said, "They can't escape." This bizarre message made him uneasy. As he slowly placed his hand on the wall, it fit perfectly into the handprint. Suddenly, an alarm sounded, and a man in rubber boots appeared at the door, taking an axe from the wall. As Jason greeted him, the escape room owner suddenly entered, and the man in the corner vanished. The owner informed Jason that there was a glitch in the system, then opened his computer and rebooted the program. On the screen, Jason could see his wife and daughters. With the system restored, the owner left the escape room. Jason found the intercom button beneath a broken phone and pressed it to speak with his wife. She said they had found the key in a jar, but they needed a 4-letter word to unlock it. Jason, puzzled, decided to request a second hint. The owner suggested observing the room from different angles. Once Jason figured out the password, he used the lights to signal the code to his wife. Smiling as he watched his family on the monitor, the man with the axe suddenly burst through the door, and the video feed was cut amid his daughter's screams. Desperate, Jason struggled to free himself from the chains on his feet. The line between reality and dreams blurred until, in a swift transition, Jason was in a hospital bed in the real world, hooked up to various machines. His wife and daughters stood by, visibly distressed. The escape room owner transformed into a nurse, entering the room to console the family before checking Jason's vital signs one last time. When the nurse shone a light into Jason's eyes, the illumination helped Jason in the escape room find his wife and daughters. Sensing danger, Jason pushed his daughter towards his wife, urging them to escape. As they left, his wife handed him the key. Snapping back to reality, Jason realized they had vanished. His wife's voice resonated, encouraging him that he could do it. Seeing shadows in the passage, Jason quickly unlocked the chains. With the appearance of the mysterious man, Jason's doctor entered the hospital room, explaining the upcoming procedure to his wife and daughters. They would remove the feeding tube, disconnect the ventilator, and administer a muscle relaxant to ease respiratory distress. The doctor assured them that, despite the difficulty of their decision, multiple tests confirmed Jason was brain dead and that he would pass peacefully and without pain. After the doctor left, the older daughter gazed at a skiing photo surrounded by stars. In the escape room, the man swung his axe at Jason, who dodged and shone his flashlight into the man's eyes. Jason's brow furrowed as if he reacted to something in reality. He scrambled towards the passageway, but the man pulled him back, choking him. With the monitors in the hospital room being turned off, the man in the escape room released Jason, walked away, and opened a small vial. The nurse administered the injection into Jason. In the escape room, Jason began shouting into the intercom. The man with the syringe approached slowly. At the last moment, Jason glimpsed the number 9. In reality, his wife noticed a change in Jason on the hospital bed as the green exit sign lit up, and Jason opened his eyes, suggesting he had the nightmare that way. The 5th story begins with a famous composer, Burnham, finishing the symphony's score with deep concentration, only to catch a glimpse of a shadow in the glass behind him. Terrified, he shouted at it to leave, then moved a cabinet to barricade the door. Taking a gun from the drawer, he aimed it at the door. When he saw the shadowy figure pass by and heard a continuous knocking, he turned the gun on himself. Jonah, a piano tuner, had been tasked with tuning a piano. The maid led him to the study, where the sight of the piano amazed him, and he eagerly began to play it. A woman entered the room, explaining that the piano hadn't been played in decades, and asked him to tighten the strings. She added with some regret that it had belonged to her late husband and lamented that she couldn't play. As Jonah packed up his things, he noticed many statues and scores related to the famous composer Burnham and asked if her husband had been a fan. Jonah himself had studied Burnham's 5th Symphony and, inspired by him, attempted to compose before life led him in another direction, though he remained a loyal fan. The maid handed Jonah a glass of water and as she left, called the woman Mrs. Burnham. Jonah then realized that this was the home of his idol and that he was playing on the very piano where the symphonies were born. Once Mrs. Burnham left, Jonah began working. As he tuned the piano, he sensed something was wrong and opened the piano lid to investigate. Inside, he found a hidden sheet of music and decided to inform Mrs. Burnham. However, when he approached her, she was with a guest. Mrs. Burnham introduced Jonah to the elderly man with the white beard as Burnham's lawyer and her good friend. Jonah greeted the lawyer politely and, with permission, sat down to show them the manuscript he'd discovered. Jonah noticed that part of the manuscript was unfinished and was eager to know if it was his idol's work. The lawyer confirmed that it was indeed Burnham's, which thrilled Jonah. He saw this as a monumental discovery, a treasured manuscript found long after the musician's death, which, if completed, could take the world by storm. However, Mrs. Burnham showed little emotion and instead asked the maid to leave the room. The maid quietly closed the door but lingered outside to eavesdrop. Mrs. Burnham calmly asked Jonah if he was aware of the curse of the Ninth Symphony, a belief that composers who reached their Ninth Symphony were cursed. The lawyer cited famous examples such as Mahler, who tried to avoid the curse by creating a famous piece as a song cycle instead of a symphony, yet the curse was not fooled. After finishing the music, Mahler's wife had an affair, his daughter died unexpectedly, and his health deteriorated. Mrs. Burnham continued, saying Mahler's death deeply affected her husband. 2 months after the funeral, he announced he was composing a new symphony to honor his friend Mahler. Strangely, her husband had composed previous symphonies with ease, but this one seemed to torment him. Initially, the lawyer thought Burnham had run out of inspiration, but looking back, it was clear Burnham was terrified of the curse. This fear lasted until one night when Mrs. Burnham was going upstairs and heard her husband yelling in the study. She rushed over and pressed her ear to the door, hearing strange noises inside. She tried to open the door but was blocked by the cabinet. She repeatedly tried until she managed to push through, only to witness her husband shoot himself to meet Satan. Ending her recollection, Mrs. Burnham told Jonah that after Burnham's death, they honored his wish by burying his unfinished manuscripts with him. While the manuscript would surely attract attention, she still wanted to respect her husband's last wishes. The maid at the door listened intently, her mind filled with thoughts. Later, the maid found Jonah in the study and casually mentioned details about Burnham's funeral. Her abrupt remarks puzzled Jonah, but she handed him the back door key, advising him to leave quietly that way so as not to disturb Mrs. Burnham, who usually retired at 9 on weekdays. Jonah didn't quite catch the maid's meaning, so she handed him the key to the garden shed, cautioning him not to trip over the shovel inside. Finally, Jonah understood, suspecting a misunderstanding. He tried to explain, but the maid cut him off, reminding him to leave after 9, and walked away from the study. It was soon 9 p.m., and Mrs. Burnham was sitting at the table in front of the garden working on a jigsaw puzzle. The maid prepared her bed and made hot cocoa, but Mrs. Burnham insisted on finishing the puzzle before going to sleep. At this time, Jonah arrived on the lawn, following the maid's instructions. Fortunately, Mrs. Burnham did not notice him. The maid pretended to help with the puzzle to distract her. Just as Mrs. Burnham finished and began to admire her work, the maid swept all the puzzle pieces back into the box. On the lawn, Jonah dug up Burnham's grave and removed the manuscript from the composer's chest. The maid arrived soon after, and the two began arguing over how to split the discovery. Jonah insisted that this was one of the greatest finds in the world, and it should be turned into a composition and performed publicly. The maid disagreed, arguing that Burnham's name would make the symphony sell for a hefty price. The maid's desecration of Jonah's sacred view of music angered him, and he struck her on the head with the shovel. As the clock chimed, Jonah began shoveling dirt back into the grave. A short while later, the maid woke up. Despite her pleas for mercy and help, Jonah kept shoveling. Afterward, Jonah was constantly on edge, but a few days later he was contacted by Mrs. Burnham. When he entered her house, she explained that the maid had suddenly disappeared, so she was hosting him today. Jonah tried to console her, but she speculated that the maid was hiding underground. She then led Jonah to the study where the lawyer was waiting. At first, Jonah thought the piano was having issues again and asked what they wanted him to play. The lawyer calmly asked him to play the song he dug up from the ground and placed the manuscript Jonah had found in the piano in front of him. Jonah nervously began playing the piece, but when he looked up, the mud-covered maid stood where Mrs. Burnham had been. Jonah screamed in a chicken voice and jumped up. The lawyer kindly suggested that Jonah needed a glass of water, but Mrs. Burnham wondered aloud if the maid would ever return. Jonah realized they knew what he had done. The lawyer told him he had known about the maid's encouragement to steal the manuscript. It turns out they had allowed this to happen to use it as leverage. Burnham had been dead for years, and his wife was nearly bankrupt. Just as she was about to declare bankruptcy, she discovered the unfinished manuscript. Hearing this, Jonah quickly took the manuscript out of his bag and handed it to the lawyer, but he seemed to want more. The symphony was still unfinished, the lawyer continued, and at that moment, Mrs. Burnham returned with a cup of water. They agreed that no one was better suited to completing the manuscript than Burnham's biggest fan. Jonah insisted he couldn't complete the piece, especially with the curse of the Ninth Symphony. Mrs. Burnham sternly told him that the curse was nonsense, only meant to influence him psychologically. As long as he didn't give in, the curse wouldn't affect him. Jonah was still reluctant, but they continued to threaten him with the maid's death. Finally, he was left alone in the large study with the piano. Jonah thought long and hard, unable to begin composing. His thoughts drifted until Burnham appeared to him. With inspiration from his idol, Jonah changed the sonata form, slowly humming a melody. Burnham's image became clearer in Jonah's mind. Jonah turned and asked the figure behind the sofa why he chose to help him. Burnham replied that he wanted to know when the curse would take effect on Jonah. He bluntly stated that Jonah would never achieve his level of greatness because Jonah was filled with fear when composing. His fear of the Ninth Symphony led him to become a piano tuner. He even ridiculed Jonah as a coward. Burnham's words hit Jonah hard. He moved his idol's statue off the table and, calming down, began composing as if to prove Burnham wrong. Jonah completed the composition overnight. Early the next morning, Mrs. Burnham opened the study door and saw Jonah slumped motionless over the table. She cautiously approached and reached for the manuscript, but Jonah suddenly awoke. Seeing the score completed, Mrs. Burnham eagerly examined it. Then Jonah handed her a single page from the piano, telling her that with it, the Ninth Symphony was finished. Without thinking much, Mrs. Burnham added the final page to the manuscript, binding it all together. As she closed it, something seemed to occur to her. Jonah congratulated her on completing her husband's symphony and noted that it was fortunate she didn't believe in the absurd curse of the Ninth Symphony. Feigning calmness, Mrs. Burnham left the room with the manuscript and slowly climbed the stairs. The lights in the living room flickered as she ascended. A shadow seemed to follow her on the staircase, passing briefly in the mirror. After Mrs. Burnham left, Jonah packed his tools and prepared to leave. At that moment, Mrs. Burnham reached the corridor and sensed something amiss behind her. Turning around, she saw nothing, thinking it was her imagination, when suddenly, death appeared before her. Panicked, she lost her balance and fell down the stairs. Downstairs, Jonah was about to leave when he heard the noise and rushed over. Mrs. Burnham's body was twisted into the eerie shape of the number 9, surrounded by the scattered manuscript. Thus, the story ends. Every character in this tale had their schemes. The lawyer and Mrs. Burnham deliberately involved the tuner and revealed the buried manuscript to the maid and tuner. Once the manuscript was unearthed and the tuner accidentally killed the maid, they used it to coerce him into completing the manuscript. Unexpectedly, the tuner left the final step to Mrs. Burnham. The so-called Grim Reaper was likely just the lawyer in disguise. His emphasis on the curse of the Ninth Symphony was merely to instill psychological fear in Mrs. Burnham. The sixth story begins with the number 9 bars bustling with people. A woman in a red dress went to the restroom to wash her hands. She noticed how nice the hand soap smelled and, when no one was looking, grabbed the bottle and put it in her bag. She approached one of the stalls, knocked, and slowly opened the door. Inside was a bearded man who greeted her warmly and flexed his handsome beard. The woman asked the bearded man to keep guard using his sensitive beard while she went in and carefully cleaned the toilet. The bearded man asked if she had met the 2 actor partners yet, referring to Reese and Steve. The woman in red said she had met Reese, who seemed to enjoy being surrounded by admirers. Speaking of which, neither of them could believe that the show Inside Number 9 that initially seemed unlikely had gone on for 9 seasons. However, the woman in red felt the series should end, as the writing had become self-indulgent, losing the audience's interest. The bearded man leaned in and whispered in her ear that Steve had left the set mid-audition recently, possibly due to health issues. At that moment, a woman in a black suit entered. The bearded man quickly closed the stall door and told her the toilet was clogged. The woman left in frustration. After she was gone, the bearded man mentioned that a very annoying woman, Catherine, had just arrived. Unexpectedly, the woman in red sternly informed him that she was Catherine, revealing he had gotten her name wrong yet again. Both squeezed back into the stall, and upon hearing that Steve had landed a role in a new Amazon project, the bearded man became emotional. Catherine suggested he have his agent try to negotiate another opportunity, then ended their conversation. A while later, Reese entered the restroom looking for his partner, only to run into a producer whom he hadn't seen in a long time. The producer asked about his plans, and Reese explained that he and Steve were developing a comedy for the broadcasting company where they would play detectives. As for Inside Number 9, it wasn't entirely abandoned, and they could still film special episodes if the audience desired. The producer then handed Reese a stack of outlines, mentioning he had new ideas for an unfilmed episode. He asked Reese about the rumored incident during the filming of the final episode. Reese admitted that his partner had suffered a seizure on set, which was terrifying, though he quickly recovered and returned to work. The producer tried to press further, but Reese, clearly drained, brushed him off and ended the conversation before leaving the restroom. Soon after, Steve came in, practicing his lines for a new film in front of the mirror. Deep in concentration, he didn't notice an actress entering with a drink. She quickly sensed that Steve was avoiding Reese. With no way to hide it, Steve explained that he had auditioned for a new project at another company. Just when he was about to give up hope of hearing back, the producers called him for a meeting. He had to pretend to be sick to leave the set and meet with the producers, who later offered him the role. However, filming would be in Los Angeles and Canada for 7 years, requiring him to relocate. Coincidentally, Reese had started working on a radio comedy about a foolish detective. Steve felt frustrated with Reese, having collaborated for 25 years, and now wanted to focus on himself. The Loud Bar made a TV host head to the restroom to record his interview with Steve. Pleased with the night's celebration, Steve expressed gratitude to his old friends for supporting Inside Number 9 for 10 years. While awaiting the host's next question, he began reading sponsored ads. Steve then revealed his new job in the interview, a major role in an Amazon production, clarifying that he wouldn't be involved in his old partner Reese's new comedy. Reese emerged from a stall, and an awkward tension filled the room between the two partners. Reese stated he was unaware of Steve's actions behind his back and was curious how Steve planned to explain himself. Before the host could finish, Reese grabbed the microphone and confronted his partner. As the argument escalated, the host interjected, taking the microphone and unexpectedly reading more ad copy. Steve and Reese exchanged puzzled looks, but patiently waited for the host to finish. Reese demanded to know when Steve auditioned. Steve claimed he couldn't remember, but the host reminded him, revealing the audition coincided with Steve's alleged illness on set. Realizing he'd been deceived, Reese grew angrier, prompting the TV host to quickly wrap up the awkward interview. After the host left, the two began to argue. Reese believed that even if Steve wanted to move on, he should have been honest with him. But Steve felt that with the end of Inside Number 9, their partnership was also over, and he was free to do whatever he wanted. As their argument heated up, the woman in a black suit walked in, having not yet used the restroom, but Steve quickly sent her smelly butt away again. He didn't want to be tied to Reese anymore. He wanted his own name and achievements. Reese, however, thought they should stay together. They shared unique memories, laughing in their office over dialogue, staying up late to tweak minor details. He had thought they would always work together, but Steve wanted to abandon him for another project, which Reese couldn't accept. Nearly in tears, he told Steve that he truly considered him a friend and was genuinely scared when Steve fell ill. But Steve didn't seem to reciprocate that sentiment. Just then, a woman reminded them the film was about to start. Steve left the restroom first. In the theater, a compilation of all the Inside Number 9 stories played, and everyone watched with tearful eyes as they were transported back to the lively set, reminiscing about the whirlwind decade. Steve kept glancing at Reese from across the room. The majestic music and clips moved the audience from laughter to tears. After 10 years of dedication, a once overlooked sapling had grown into a towering tree. With Christine's final goodbye, the story seemed to truly conclude. As the cheese and crackers performance ended and the restaurant sign flipped from open to closed, the scene showed Steve and Reese drinking beer, congratulating each other on finally being free. Steve then received a phone call and, feeling distraught, returned to the bar to find Reese. The producer stopped him, and by the time Steve turned back, Reese had disappeared. Reese was actually hiding in a stall on a video call. Steve politely knocked and asked if his partner was inside. Still reeling from their argument, Reese didn't want to face him, so he pretended to mimic other voices to evade Steve, but Steve saw through the act. Steve informed Reese that there had been a change regarding his new role. Some producers had just called, requesting he re-audition because another actor was competing for the role. It's the bearded man who had been with Catherine earlier. Steve realized the part would likely go to the bearded actor, so he didn't want to waste time auditioning again. He also began to criticize the script, which he thought was poorly written. Steve then asked what Reese planned to do next. Reese admitted he was lost and unsure, as he lacked confidence working alone. Steve started singing a song from Cheese and Crackers, but Reese cut him off after only 2 lines. However, Reese then shared with his partner that there was a third option. Soon, clips of their comedy played, and familiar faces appeared on the screen. While Inside Number 9 seemed to have ended, its story was far from over. Thus, the story concludes.